He was pulling a hobo thing on me, which is called putting the bum on a guy. Giving him something value for a beer or a meal or something like that. It turned out that in the 30s and the 40s he rode the rails. He was an organizer for the IWW and later became a union steward for the AFL-CIO. A great many of the people who traveled the rails during the Depression were labor organizers. And many big companies hired agencies like the Pinkertons to kill them, to chase them out of town, to break strikes. I had the advantage of growing up in Chicago, where a great deal of the history of organized labor got its foment, because we had railroads, we had cattle, we had steel. And my friend Studs Terkel grew up in what he charitably calls a rooming house that his mother owned at the corner of Grands and Wells, which was 2 blocks away from a lovely little park in front of the Newberry Library that is now known as Dearborn Park. Well, for 100 years it was known as Bughouse Square. And on any given day, this was a marketplace of ideas for free thinkers. This is where Emma Goldman and John Reed spoke when they were in Chicago. This is where the famous clap doctor, Dr. Ben Reitman, treated people for free outside because he believed healthcare was a human right. But every political crank, whack job, and union organizer gathered in Bughouse Square to gather what was a constituency. And out of that gathering came the American labor movement. And it spread west, and it spread south, and it spread east, and eventually there were unions. A lot of people have a very low opinion of unions today, but the reason that you don't have to work 12 hours a day anymore is because somebody in the union got their head kicked in 70 years ago. The reason you work for a living wage is because of unions. As they grew, they became as corrupt as many of the things they fought against. Some of them, not all of them. But all of this stuff came out of hobo culture. In Barstow, California, in 1917, 10 United Mine Worker labor organizers were summarily executed as they got off a boxcar. Nobody was ever prosecuted for it. This set the labor movement on fire. And it started a whole backlash of people kind of fighting back. And that's when you began to really see these symbols everywhere. Because hobos and people who traveled by rail had to let each other know exactly what they were in store for. So this is a language of hunger and dispossession, and I think hope. We lost Studs Terkel October 31st last year. He was 96 years old. One of the things he used to lament the last 5 years of his life was that collectively Americans suffered from a national Alzheimer's. That as a body politic we had lost our memory. He said, you know, kid, after I go, they're not going to remember the labor movement or World War II or even the Civil Rights movement. And then he'd go, it's because of that goddamn internet. And there is something to that. There is something to the foreshortening of our memory because media constantly, we now have a 24-hour news cycle. 50 years ago, we didn't have that. When the hobo alphabet was first invented, it was right after the Civil War, and what we never think of is that less than half of Americans were literate. Less than half of Americans could read or write. There's anecdotal evidence that suggests these come out of cattle brands, because a lot of the men who rode the rails were cattlemen. And then it basically took on its own kind of idiomatic shape and symbolism. One of the things Studs kept saying is that, that the hobo language was kind of the only language that a lot of people that stayed in his mother's rooming house understood that was actually written down. Studs went to law school. and by his own definition, he was a miserable lawyer. He never met a petition he didn't like. He was working towards civil rights as early as the late 20s. He was blacklisted in the 50s for having Mahalia Jackson on his television show. Studs Terkel had the second television show ever put on television. He was blacklisted and he was fired and labeled a communist and didn't work for 15 years. He spent a great deal of that time going to Bughouse Square and listening to union leaders. When he was a small boy, he saw Emma Goldman and Dr. Ben Reitman walking down Michigan Avenue hand in hand. What he described as the two poorest and richest people in the world. So it was out of that landscape that the way he saw the world kind of became fermented. And he was my dear friend and was my mentor for 32 years, and well, it all kind of rolled downhill, and now I got people calling me a socialist. I can live with it. I think one of my favorite movies is called The Emperor of the North. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's not a great movie, but one of the interesting things about it is that everybody who made that film was blacklisted in the 50s. Robert Aldrich, Lee Marvin, and Ernest Borgnine. And that script had been kicking around since 1940. Everybody's fingerprints were on it. There's the man who's credited with writing it, nobody'd ever heard of before, because it was a ghost name for an American writer named Dalton Trumbo, who also wrote Johnny Got His Gun and a couple other anti-war pictures. And it's basically just a shadow story of fascism. And Lee Marvin plays A Number One. He has no other name in this film except A Number One. And he's the coolest hobo you've ever seen. You know, come on, it's Lee Marvin. And Ernest Borgnine plays a conductor who is only known as Shaq. And it is Ernest Borgnine that is overacting, pop-eyed, bug-eyed, sweating best. He is an absolute stone sadist. And every hobo that rides his train, he murders with a sledgehammer. Now, in the information along with this, you see a lot of the hobo alphabet. You see guys, whenever Shaq's train comes, they all warn each other. You know, and they put the symbol for "you will be beaten," which is just a stick and a line coming off of it with a man doing that. And that's exactly how Shaq killed everyone. Lee Marvin, Ernest Borgnine, Robert Aldrich, they all learned the hobo alphabet. In fact, there was a written test before they started rehearsal for what each symbol meant. What was funny is that Aldrich was blacklisted for being a friend of Dalton Trumbo's. Marvin was blacklisted and did not give a fuck. Sent a telegram back to the House of Un-American Activities Committees with 2 words on it: fuck you. Ernest Borgnine had just won the Oscar for playing Marty, and sent a telegram after Marvin saying, "Come to my house, I'd like to meet with you, I will kick the shit out of you in my front yard. By the way, I just won the Oscar." So in essence, when these guys, and a great deal of them stood up to the blacklist. Humphrey Bogart did, and Gary Cooper did, and Marvin, and a great many directors. Joseph Losey, when they said, "We think you're a communist," he goes, "I am a communist. I joined the Communist Party in 1930, and I'm still a communist." So they really couldn't do much to him. He went to England and made movies. What these men also had in common is that when they were young men, they rode the rails. They knew hobos. They knew this language. And by the end of the 1950s, most of the hobo culture was actually gone. But it had been sticking in Lee Marvin's craw forever that this movie should get made. In 1973, they made it. And it's basically a good versus evil thing. It's about poor people who have nothing trying to survive, being beat down by one guy. He is a train conductor. And what the movie reminds us is that this one guy abusing his power, who is not a police captain, not a politician, not a president, not a senator, but has an immense amount of discretionary power over the lives of hungry people.